Welcome to Bankole Nation. I'm your host, Bankole Thompson. Thank you so much for joining us on Season 2, Episode 1. And of course, thank you all who have subscribed to our weekly podcast, Bankole Nation, and joining this conversation. Coming up, we're looking at why the media in Detroit is running against Reverend Solomon Kenlock, who is running for mayor. Why is the establishment running against Reverend Solomon Kenlock, who is running for mayor of Detroit? Why are some of the black elites running against Reverend Solomon Kenlock, who is running for mayor of Detroit? An analysis coming up from me about this race. You want to listen to it because we're going deeper this time to separate fact from fiction and to remember the words of the great writer, philosopher, and thinker, Frantz Fanon, who says, and I quote, "Each generation must out of relative obscurity discover its mission, fulfill it, or betray it." We're just getting started. Stay with us. Welcome to Bankole Nation. I'm your host, Bankole Thompson. Thank you so much for joining us on this weekly conversation, this weekly podcast. We begin our second season. And of course, in our first season, we taped 20 episodes. And I want to begin by thanking all of you who have subscribed to our YouTube page, Bankole Nation. Go to our YouTube page and please subscribe and share with your friends and family members and so forth. You can also subscribe to Apple iTunes. You can subscribe to Amazon Music. You can subscribe to Spotify and wherever you get your podcasts. Subscribe and share this weekly edifying information, edifying and empowering information that comes to you every week from us here. And of course, I want to begin with what is obvious, and that is the 2025 Detroit mayor's race here in the city of Detroit. One of the nation's largest urban centers. It's always called ground zero of the urban crisis. We call it the epicenter of the urban crisis, the heartbeat of Black America. And in the 2025 Detroit mayor's race, if you've been paying attention, it gives the presumption or the appearance that, in fact, there is only one candidate running for mayor, and that is Reverend Solomon Kenlock, the senior pastor of Triumph Church. Reverend Kenlock is one of 9 candidates running for mayor of Detroit. But if you've been paying attention, you would think Kenlock is the only candidate running for mayor. And of course, he's one of the leading candidates. And that has struck fear, not only in the establishment, but also among their allies in the media. Now, as a veteran of the media industry, one who has had a long time front row seat to the business of media, one who is an authority on the business of the media. In fact, we're going to show it on the screen. The first book I wrote was in 2006. How many years ago is that? That's 19 years ago, 2006. My first book was titled Ignoring the Underprivileged, a journalist's indictment of mainstream media, where I talked about race and class. And in that book, I talked about how the media covered Hurricane Katrina. They showed Black people who were looking for help, calling them looters, and white folk basically looking for help, and they basically say they're looking for help. And I talked about just the media's coverage, how it's slanted against Black folk, how sometimes the mainstream media does a great disservice to the existence of Black people, how the mainstream media undercuts Black legitimacy, how the mainstream media tries to define the narrative for Black existence. The book, Ignoring the Underprivileged, as we show it to you on the screen now, the foreword to my book in 2006 was written by the late Cliff Russell. Cliff Russell was a very good and dear friend of mine who supported me in every sense of the word. I used to appear on American Black Journal back then. And in fact, Tony Martley, then executive producer, would invite me to appear on Cliff Russell when he was hosting American Black Journal to talk about the issues affecting Detroit. So Cliff Russell wrote the foreword to that book that I wrote in 2006 titled Ignoring the Underprivileged, a journalist's indictment of mainstream media. And I remember Professor Charles Simmons, an elder in our community, who was also supportive of my efforts, He was at the time the head of the journalism program at Eastern Michigan University. Professor Charles Simmons was using my book as a required reading for his class at Eastern Michigan University. And so I have been a long-time authority on the business of the media, as well as a journalist and one who has written and spoken in this space for a long time. And after I wrote that book in 2006, of course, the book that followed was another book titled A Matter of Black Transformation. I hope you can see it on the screen here. This book I wrote, again, followed Ignoring the Underprivileged. And the foreword to this book was written by my good friend, Dr. Bernard Lafayette. Dr. Bernard Lafayette was one of the original freedom riders. Dr. Lafayette was one of the key members of Dr. King's inner circle, a strategist. And of course, he was the one that Dr. King chose to initiate the historic voting rights campaign in Selma, the cradle of the civil rights movement. So this book, written way back in 2007, 2008, it was my second book. And in all of this, I talk about the role of the media. And I followed that with another book I wrote in 2010 titled Obama and Black Loyalty. And of course, this was after I became one of the first Black editors, Black editors in the nation, to have a series of exclusive interviews with President Barack Obama. So I followed that in 2010 with this book, Obama and Black Loyalty. Again, I talked about the role of the media in this book. Then 2010, and then in 2011, I wrote another book. The following year, I followed it up by another book titled Obama and Christian Loyalty, when they were talking about in the media that Obama was not a Christian, that he was a Muslim. Remember when Reverend Franklin Graham came out on an Easter Sunday morning to basically cast aspersion on Obama's fate. I talked about the importance of Black theology, citing the writings of the great theologian James Cone in this book. But again, I talk about the role of the media in this space, what the media chooses to promote and how media undercuts Black existence. This was 2011. So that's 3 books, 4 books actually I've shown you. And then, of course, I followed it up later on. This is my latest book in 2023 titled Fiery Conscience. Of course, this is my latest book, came out in 2023. So 5 books to say, all of which I established what the role of the media ought to be. And I know how the agenda is set in the media, just like the agenda has been set against Reverend Solomon Kenlock. You know, in 2004 or 2003, I recall this, I was traveling to Utah City, Utah. I was going to a conference organized by Wake Forest University, School of Medicine. They sponsored a conference. It was a science conference for journalists. And basically, they invited some of us, myself, there were journalists from USA Today, Washington Post, and other newspapers around the country who were attending this conference. And basically, it was professors at the School of Medicine talking about how we cover the environment, science issues, and all of that. But I remember when I was flying to Utah, in the plane, I was reading a book. I took a book with me titled Media Monopoly. Media Monopoly was written by a prominent white male journalist called Ben Budgekan. He was a former editor of the Washington Post. And in the book, Ben Budgekan talks about, the book is titled Media Monopoly. In fact, there's an updated version. You can go pick it up and pull it up and read it. Ben Budgekan talk about how the agenda is set in the media, who the media wants to promote and who they don't want to promote. You know, the agenda is set. And in the book, he talks about how Billy Graham was promoted in the media, how a memo went out to major newspapers across this country, indicating that whenever there's a story around Billy Graham, it needs to be given prominence in the media. So I know how the agenda is set. As an authority on the media, and as a preeminent voice of conscience and courage in this business, and in Detroit, I know how the game is played. And I know the game that has been played against Reverend Solomon Kenlock, because Kenlock is independent. He's a Black man who was able to build a church, you know, out of the ashes of 50 members and made it a national attention, made it a national institution. He doesn't need the support of the establishment to do what he does. He doesn't need the support of the status quo. He doesn't need the support of the Black elites to do what he does. And they know that. He doesn't have a handout. You know, he's not kneeling down like a slave asking for help. And so when a candidate like Kenlock emerges on the political scene, oh, we got a problem. We can't let that happen. We can't let him get close to the power structure in downtown Detroit. We can't let him become the decision maker. And that's part of the reason why there's this campaign, a well-coordinated campaign in the media establishment, in the echo chamber, to try to delegitimize Solomon Kenlock or to try to metaphorically lynch him in the media. That's what this campaign is all about. And they got their willing allies, all around the city. You wonder, why is there so much scrutiny of Reverend Kenlock? Why is it that the other candidates who are running, the 8 other candidates, are not being scrutinized to the extent that Kenlock is being scrutinized? Why are they not doing that? Because they are afraid of Reverend Solomon Kenlock. Because he's a brother who has shown over the years that you can build an institution, you can establish things outside of being dependent on the system. And so when someone with that kind of a mindset is willing to cast the dice and run for mayor, they got a problem with it. They have a problem because they want somebody in there who's dependable on the system, somebody who is susceptible to media manipulation, somebody who is susceptible to the status quo manipulation, somebody who is susceptible to the establishment manipulation. That's who they want. That's why the only scrutiny that has been rendered in this mayoral campaign has been Reverend Solomon Kenlock. And they went as far back as 1993. I was talking to a friend of mine earlier today. I said, 1993, I said, brother, 1993 is a whole different century. That's even before the .com era. That's before Yahoo.com. That's a whole different century. We're in a whole new century. But they're willing to go a generation back, 30 years back, to see what Solomon Kenlock did, what Reverend Kenlock did in his personal relationships that was not approving, and come back and tell you why he is not good. That's how the agenda is set. And that's why there's a concerted effort to make sure that Reverend Kenlock does not appear as one of the two candidates in the general election in 2025. Because the goal here is to eliminate his candidacy in the August 5th primary. And that only will happen if you let it happen. I'm just telling the truth. What is good for the goose must be good for the gander. If you're going to scrutinize Solomon Kenlock, go scrutinize the other candidates. Tell us what the other candidates also, tell us what they were doing in 1993. Tell us what they did 2 years ago. Tell us what they did 4 years ago. Look into their background. They know what to do. The media knows very well what to do. But also, this is also part of what I call the racial caste system. See, because I know this business, and I think I'm one of the few people in this town with the authority, with the modern historical authority to speak on this issue like the way I do, because I've had a front row seat to this issue for a long time. So I know the games that they're playing. I know the outcome that they want. And the outcome is that they don't want Solomon Kenlock to be one of the 2 candidates in the general election. Because if that happens, then they got a problem on their hands. Because the people's movement becomes a real movement now. And they know that. A man with 40,000 members in his church, as Reverend Kenlock has, they can't afford that. They said he has foot soldiers. We can't let this happen. We can't take our chances with Kenlock being one of 2 candidates in the general election. So we have to eliminate his candidacy in the August 5th primary next Tuesday. Let's basically take him out. Let's take his candidacy out. And that's why they're dropping these stories, and that's why they're doing what they're doing. Because the racial caste system operates from a white supremacist perspective. And that is, as Black folk, we can only rise so much. And even in our rise, they have to determine the extent to which we rise. Our late great ancestor, Maya Angelou, said, You may cut me down with your lies. You may cut me down with your bitter, twisted lies, and still I rise. Maya Angelou was speaking about the racial caste system that exists in the media. Isabel Wilkerson, the author of Caste, I have it right here. Caste, the origins of our discontent. I have the book right here. In fact, let me take it out for you. I have the book right here. The origins of our discontent. Isabel Wilkerson writes about it in Caste. What this racial caste system does. I have the book next to Nelson Mandela's Long Walk to Freedom, because you know what? Reverend Solomon Kenlock and all of us are in a long walk to freedom. And in this long walk to freedom, we're dealing with a racial caste system that wants to determine how far our journey would be and how far we should rise. And what we can do. That there should be limits. There should be limitations to the freedoms that we demand. Something I highlighted in 2022 when I gave a keynote lecture for Brown University Black History Month. Yeah. Think about it. And that is the reason why they're against Reverend Kenlock. That is the reason why it appears as if Reverend Kenlock is the only candidate running for mayor. You have 8 candidates, 8 other candidates. None of them have come on the sweltering and withering scrutiny like Reverend Kenlock. And you wonder why. You should not wonder why. The racial caste system says we're going to determine how far this Negro candidate is going to go. We don't like him. He's too independent. He built an institution. You know, some may say he have a chip on his soldier. You know, I've been told that many times. Or Bankole got chip on his soldier. I hear it all the time. Now, they know I don't care what they think about me. I don't care. Bankole Thompson, you take it or leave it. It don't matter. I don't care. What you say about me or what you write about me does not matter. Because I know whose I am and I know from whence I came. It's as simple as that. I'm very clear about what we need to do. I'm very clear about what we have to do to advance the quest for equity and accountability. And the other side to the scrutiny of Reverend Kenlock is the fact that Mayor Mike Duggan, when he became the first white mayor in 40 years in 2014, when he was running, he never came under this scrutiny. They didn't tell us what Mike Duggan did in 1993. They didn't go there. You know, despite the fact that he was the CEO of the Detroit Medical Center, they paid almost $30 million to the federal government for some fines. It never became an issue in the press. Mayor Duggan was in the McNamara administration. And we know what that administration was all about. It was not in the media. No. Mike Duggan was treated like a white savior. He, like I said in a Facebook post, Mayor Mike Duggan was allowed to ride on a white horse to City Hall. And with media cheerleaders, accompanied by some members of the Black elite, shouting Hosanna in the highest with their own palm leaves for Mayor Mike Duggan. That's what they did. No scrutiny. And when he took over office, serving 3 terms, he had all kinds of scandals, all kinds of stinky, nasty, whatever scandal you call it, all kinds of scandals. It never played up in his reelection. No, it never played up in his reelection. Yeah. And I know why, because he's a powerful white male. That's what happens. White is right and white is might. Reverend Joseph Lowry, the late dean of the Civil Rights Movement, Reverend Joseph Lowry, another great ancestor. Remember his inaugural prayer at President Barack Obama's inauguration? White is might, white is right. Yeah. You know, black get back. That's how Mike Duggan was treated. White is right, white is might, black get back. And that's what they're reminding Reverend Solomon Kenlock, 2025 Detroit mayoral candidate, telling him, black get back. And that's what you're seeing. Because you wonder, Why is there so much interest in his candidacy? If they're not afraid of him, then why is the scrutiny on him? Because he's the most potent candidate in this race, the one that they believe has a propensity to win. And there are some who are asking the question, how dare he think he could become the mayor of the city? What audacity, what unmitigated gall for him to run for mayor. He needs to stay within the confines of his church. And that goes against the historical record. It goes against the historical narrative. Now, the media doesn't care about the narrative. The plan is to delegitimize Reverend Solomon Kenlock so that he can lose in the August 5th primary. And what they're doing, and the questions that some are questioning in Detroit, these are very small town. We're all connected to pretty much the same people. By the time you're done talking about Bankole, I've got the message that you were there talking about me. By the time you finish talking about Kenlock or any other person, the word has gone back. We're a very small community and we're connected to the same cast of characters. And when they say Reverend Kenlock, a minister has no reason to run for politics, it goes against the historical grain, the historical record of Black existence in this nation, going all the way back, right? If you look at it in New York, this was something I wrote about in my Detroit News column. Adam Clayton Powell, Congressman Adam Clayton Powell. Think about it. And there were other candidates, other ministers who ran for public office and have successfully done so. The most recent, Reverend Raphael Warnock, United States Senator from Georgia, the first Black U.S. Senator from Southern Georgia, senior pastor of Ebenezer Church, Martin Luther King Jr.'s pulpit. Reverend Warnock got elected U.S. Senator. So when you say that a minister cannot be, the mayor cannot be, what are you saying? Are you saying that the template that we see with Reverend Warnock is wrong? Are you saying it's not a legitimate quest for Black political empowerment? Think about that. So when you remain unaware of these issues, you remain ignorant of these facts, what they try to do in the media and within the establishment is to dump down our knowledge of these issues. Some folks say, well, he's not Reverend Warnock. Well, Solomon Kenlock never said he was Reverend Warnock. I don't think anybody should try to copy anybody. You have to be yourself. Reverend Warnock doesn't have 40,000 members in his church. Of course, he has a powerful church, Martin Luther King's pulpit. Kenlock has 40,000 members. Other ministers have certain number of members, right? But the question is, who decides who should run? Because the establishment wants to make sure that with Mike Duggan running for governor as an independent, that they pick who they want in there. And the establishment wants a puppet. They want a puppet. They don't want Kenlock. They want a puppet. Yeah. And the puppet masters are working 24/7 to ensure that Kenlock doesn't make it into the primary. And that's the game plan. That's why they're dropping all of this. Because their nightmare is that Reverend Solomon Kenlock, senior pastor of Triumph Church, comes out in the primary either as the highest vote getter or the second highest vote getter. That would be a nightmare of unprecedented proportion for the establishment and their allies in the media. Oh, that would be a nightmare. That's why they're going overdrive. Just on the surface level, on the scale of media fairness, if you're scrutinizing one candidate, it behooves you to scrutinize the other candidates. Give them the same level of scrutiny. Give them the same level of scrutiny. If you want to know what Kenlock did in 1993, go find out what the other candidates were doing back then as well. Or go find out what they did recently, if it is of equal proportion to what Kenlock did. Go look into their background as well. Go look into their background. But they've not done that. And they wouldn't do it. Because the plan here is set in motion and it's set in stone. We got to eliminate him out of the primary. We have to make sure that he loses the primary because he's the most feared candidate and he's the one who has a propensity to be independent, to be divorced from the establishment, and who's going to represent the aspirations of the people. Yeah. So we need somebody. We can't let that happen. So we need to pick our candidates. And we know who their candidates are. And, you know, this is what Black people have to deal with. This is what Black people have to deal with. You know, I see this all the time. And sometimes I chuckle at the game that is played. I chuckle at the agenda, how it is set. I chuckle how they try to decide how you should think. Because you should think that Reverend Kenlock, the plan is for you to think that Reverend Kenlock is a bad man. Or he did this in 1993 in a personal relationship. He's no good. Because they want to set your thought pattern. That is the game plan. Yeah. And here, what we're doing here on this podcast is to render you an independent Black political tool. Because nobody controls the way I think. I think they know that very well. Or they do. They do. Nobody controls how Bankole thinks. Or they know that. And I'll let them know in a heartbeat how I feel. So the plan is to control your thought pattern. To make you look at this man who was risen out of the ashes of 50 church members to 40,000 members. A man who has done so much for his community. Right? Right? Because his members are members of the community. Right? They do not exist. They don't live in a castle upstairs. They're members of the community. You know, and what is laughable is that while they're trying to make Reverend Kenlock look bad in your eyes, they've not talked about the road to redemption for Reverend Kenlock, right? From 1993, a 19-year-old, when he was 19 years old, the road to redemption, and look what he has done to 50 plus years now. What he has done with Triumph Church and how he has transformed his own life. They don't want to talk about the road to redemption. Because Black men, Black women are not given redemption. White men, white women are given redemption. Think about this. How many times have we talked about this? When you look at white serial killers, when you look at some of these young white kids who go into a school and shoot, massacre, the massacre in Aurora, when that young white guy went into a movie theater in Aurora and massacred. The story that came out in the Denver Post was that, oh, you know, he was so brilliant and smart. He was a science guy. He was neuroscience. I mean, they try to extol the virtues of young white serial killers or young white men who act like a nut going into schools and engage in mass shootings. The media extols the virtues. They raise the virtues of those young white kids. They say, even though he killed so many people, remember, he wanted to be a scientist. He wanted to be a journalist. He wanted to be a doctor. He wanted to be an engineer. He was so smart. They try to create a road to redemption for these young white kids. But they don't do that when the culprits or the alleged culprits are Black people. When it's a young Black man or a young Black female, they say he's a beast. You know, treat him by the letter of the law, charge him, and you know, let him face the consequences of the law. That's what they do. So when it comes to white folk, there's a road to redemption, no matter the crime. But when it comes to Black people, there's no road to redemption, and that's what they're doing with Reverend Solomon Kenlock. They said no road to redemption for him. If he was a white man, that would not happen. If Solomon Kenlock was a white man, they will never go to 1993. They will never do that. They'll give him the same treatment they did Mayor Mike Duggan. And that's determined by the racial caste system in the media. You know, I can write a book on this. I can write a trilogy on this. You know, every time I get invited to give a lecture at the University of Michigan, the Gerald Ford School of Public Policy, I remember one time when I was giving a lecture during COVID, I did a Zoom lecture for them. They invited me to deliver an hour lecture to a graduate class. In the class was one of the, I think the mayor of Troy was in that class, all of these professionals in the class. I talked about the role of the media, and the questions were about why I'm so hard on Mayor Mike Duggan, why I criticize him so much. I explained that because I know how the media operates. I know what the racial caste system does. I just did it in January when I was invited to the University of Michigan undergraduate class, spoke to this class that studies the works of Frederick Douglass. They invited me to give their opening semester lecture in January. I talked about the role of the media, the racial caste system, and why people like us who are voices of conscience must continue to advance the interests of Black existence and the collective interests of our communities. We cannot back down, right? James Weldon Johnson says, "Stony the road we trod," right? We cannot back down. And this is part of the problem. A road to redemption for white folk, white candidates, but no road to redemption for Solomon Kenlock. He doesn't deserve redemption, even though everybody deserves redemption. Everybody deserves a second chance. Remember Michael Vick? After he finished his sentence, when he's involved in that scandal, with animals, dogs, remember what happened? When he came out after he finished his sentence, they showed us pictures. The media covered it. They showed us demonstrations of white women who were still mad at Michael Vick, even though he had served his time, his sentence. No road to redemption for Black folk, but road to redemption for white people. That's why Reverend Solomon Kenlock, the senior pastor of Triumph Church, is getting the treatment he's getting from the media. Because they will never do it to him if he was a white man. They will never attempt it. A white man who started a church with 50 members and ends up building it to 40,000 members, they will never do it. They will kiss the ground he walks on. That's what they do. I've been in rooms where white men who came out of nothing end up being somebody. They walk in a room, they kiss the ground that they walk on. I've been in many rooms, y'all. I've been in many rooms. I've been in the highest rooms. I've been in the lowest rooms. I've been in the middle rooms. Yes. So I have a multi-dimensional and multi-contextual perspective to this. And more importantly, I'm an authority on these issues. I've shown you the books that I've written. 5 books. I'm an authority on these issues. I know how the media operates. I can write a trilogy on the Detroit media and the psychosis, the psychology, the mentality that drives what they're doing to try to lynch Reverend Solomon Kenlock, to try to make it look as if he's the only candidate running for mayor when he's running against 8 other candidates. Yes. I can give an entire 2-hour lecture on that to trace the origins of that mindset and how the agenda is set. And so it's up to you people who are watching and listening to this podcast, whether you will accept the decision of the racial caste system in the media. And this is the beauty of having a podcast. This is the beauty of social media, because this information can be shared and it can go viral. This is the beauty of you listening to my analysis and commentary, authoritative analysis and commentary on these issues. You see, they don't want me talking because they know I've been around. I've paid my dues in this town. I think I reminded one of the candidates running for mayor when he tried to come for me on my radio show. I think it was Tud Perkins. Yes, Tud Perkins. He knows himself. I reminded him that I've paid my dues in this town. I've taken on fights that he will never take in his life. I've taken on fights that he has never taken in his life. Tud Perkins knows. Yeah, when he called into my radio show, tried to take me on. Remember when I used to have the radio show, Red Line? Yeah, Tud Perkins called. And we did a promo on him that used to run the show all the time. Yeah. I said he needed to sit in a class. Let me give a lecture. That Bankole Thompson has paid his dues in this town. And I've had a front row seat. I know all the players. Yeah. Yeah. And I know all the Negro pork chop eaters. They know I know them. So when they say someone Kenlock, Reverend Kenlock should stay in his lane, they didn't stay in their lane. They moved from sectors to sectors, looking for pork chops. I know. I know one time one of these Negro folk, called me over the phone, almost crying, telling me I needed to raise me up because I was getting ready to meet with a powerful white male in this city, a powerful white male with very deep pocket. And this white male had invited me to participate in an event. And this brother who called me over the phone said I needed to raise me up because he thought he was going to get fired. He wanted me to put a good word because he knew that this white male, powerful white male who invited me, he knew those people respect me. They have a lot of regard for me. And so my opinion matters. So he wanted me to intervene on his behalf. And yet these Negroes are out here talking about Reverend Kenlock should stay in his lane. Oh, I know so much. They don't want Bankole on the case. They don't want me talking. But I had to come out and kick off the second season of my podcast on this issue because I don't want you to forget this. This is part of our history as Black folk. Yeah. The delegitimization campaign. That's why I talk about the need to be credentialed. I talk about the need for us to have evidence of our work, social transformation. That's why I always talk about the need for us to do the right thing. I always talk about the need for us to stand up for what is right and speak truth to power. I talk about the need for us to document the work that we do. Solomon Kenlock, Reverend Kenlock has documented his work. His work is what Triumph Church is today. Yes. And they can't stand it. They can't stand it. And if you don't tell the world what you've done, they'll erase you. The media will erase you and act like you never existed. My latest book, Fiery Conscience, documents 2 decades of my work in this town, how I have intervened and liberated our communities, intervened on behalf of folk to liberate our communities. I remember, I'm going to share a quick story before I end this podcast. I remember just 2 years ago or 3 years ago, there's a foster care group in Detroit called Homes for Black Boys, run by this sister called Jacqueline Moffett. Homes for Black Boys was going to lose their license with the state of Michigan, Department of Health and Human Services, because quote unquote, they were not acting right and their finances for some reason wasn't all that. So they were going to lose their license and so forth. Jacqueline Moffett's daughter, who's a professor in New York, reached out to me on Twitter, asked me if I would intervene on her mother's behalf. I didn't know that, but she follows me on Twitter, reached out to me. I looked at the case, I intervened. And what happened, I talked about it on the radio show, talked about it on the TV show I had, and I wrote a stinking column. I wrote a very strong column against Governor Gretchen Whitmer. I called her out. Not only did I write a column, I mentioned all the names, the head of the Department of Licensing. I put all their names, I put names on it. And what happened after I did that? Homes for Black Boys is the oldest foster care system in Detroit, existed since the 1967 race rebellion in Detroit. And the state of Michigan was going to shut them down, take away their license, without regard to that this organization was founded in 1967 out of the ashes of the 1967 race rebellion. Did the media care about it? No, it did not, because Homes for Black is Black boys. If it was Homes for White kids, they would be all over it. They would not, in fact, the state of Michigan would not be threatening to revoke a license of Homes for Black or white kids, especially if it was founded by Susan B. Anthony, who one of those who led the suffragist movement. But of course, Homes for Black Boys and run by this Black woman who seemingly has no power and so forth. So what happened? So I spoke to Jacqueline Moffett, who runs it. So I intervened. And after I wrote that column, talked about it, guess what? The state of Michigan backed down. The Department of Health and Community Service backed down And they said instead of taking away her license, they're going to work with her. This happened about 2 or 3 years ago, right? It's so much that I can't even remember. But this is what I remember, and I kept her email to this day. Jacqueline Moffett, the head of Homes for Black Boys in Detroit, sent me a Christmas message in an email. Say, thank you so much for helping save Home for Black Boys. And then she went on to tell me what the state of Michigan is now going to do. I forced them to back down. Now, I intervened because there's a racial element to this. If it was a white institute, white organization, a white nonprofit, they wouldn't require Bankole Thompson's intervention because there will be no need to revoke their license. But a black organization, who cares? We can do it. And these same black elites who are friends with Mike, who are friends with Governor Whitmer, didn't do anything. They didn't come out and say anything. They didn't do a press conference. They don't care. They don't give a damn. They only care about their pork chop and what they're going to get on the side when no one is looking. You know how the game is played in this town. You know, I know. So this is the problem we're faced with. So when you have a once-in-a-generational candidate in Reverend Solomon Kenlock, the senior pastor of Triumph Church, coming out to run for mayor, they say, oh, no, he's too independent. Oh, he's too credible. He got too much mass appeal. You know, this brother is too genuine. Yeah. He's not been having his hand out here, looking for a handout. You know, he's not part of the extortion industry. He's not part of the shakedown industry. Somebody knows what I'm talking about. The extortion industry and the shakedown industry, they all go together. He's not part of the extortion industry. He's not part of the shakedown industry. So we have to make sure he doesn't make it into the primary. And that's what this entire campaign is all about with Reverend Solomon Kinloch Jr., the senior pastor of Triumph Church. But remember this. If you remember anything in this podcast today, remember what Frantz Fanon said. Each generation must, out of relative obscurity, discover its mission, fulfill it, or betray it. And that is our responsibility. So as you go to the polls on August 5th, remember the words of Frantz Fanon. Each generation must, out of relative obscurity, discover its mission, fulfill it, or betray it. Thank you so much for being here. I'm Bankole Thompson, and we'll see you another time with more on Bankole's Nation.